Call came at 6:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I'd been awake since 5, lying in the dark with my phone on my chest, waiting. Not because anyone had told me to wait, not because anyone had said it won't be long now. I just knew. After 14 months of hospital visits and late-night drives and cold cups of coffee in waiting rooms, I had learned to read the silence the way you learn to read weather. The nurse's voice was gentle, practiced. She said my father-in-law's name first, Gerald. And then she said the words that follow a name like that at 6:47 in the morning. I said, "Thank you." I'm not sure why we say thank you at those moments, but I did. Then I sat up in bed and looked at the other side, where my husband hadn't slept in 3 days. I drove to Mercy General alone. The morning was grey and still, the kind of February morning that feels like the world is holding its breath. I took the 94 because I knew where to park, which elevator to take, which floor. I had made this drive so many times that my hands knew the turns before my mind did. I passed the Dunkin' on the corner where I'd stopped for coffee so many mornings that the woman at the window had started just handing me a medium dark roast without asking. She wasn't there that morning. The drive-through was empty. I parked in the structure, took the elevator to the 4th floor, and walked down the hallway that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. There were other rooms with other families. I could hear them, voices low and close, the particular murmur of people holding each other up. When I pushed open Gerald's door, the room was quiet. Just me. Just him. The charge nurse, a woman named Patrice, who had been kind to me from the very first week, came in a few minutes after. She checked the monitors. She wrote something on her clipboard. Then she looked at me in that careful way medical people look at you when they're about to say something that matters, and she said, "He asked us to give you this. Last night, when he was still able to, he asked specifically that you be the one to receive it." She held out an envelope. My name was on the front, not my husband's. Mine. Written in Gerald's handwriting, which had gotten shaky in the last few months but was still recognizably his, that old-fashioned cursive, the kind they don't teach anymore. I held it without opening it. Let me tell you about Gerald, because if you're going to understand any of this, you have to understand him first. Gerald Patton was 73 years old and had spent 40 of those years building a small chain of hardware stores across rural Michigan. Not glamorous work, not the kind of thing that gets you written up in any magazine. But he had built something real, 3 stores, loyal employees, a reputation in towns where reputation was still the currency that mattered. He had soft eyes and rough hands, and he laughed at his own jokes before the punchline landed, every single time, without fail. I met him 2 weeks before I met his son. My husband, I'll call him Derek, was late to his own family's 4th of July cookout, the summer we started dating. His sister had invited me, we'd been friends since grad school, and I spent the first hour of that afternoon sitting on Gerald's back porch listening to him explain the difference between Phillips and Robertson screws with a level of enthusiasm that made me feel like I was missing out on something important. By the time Derek finally showed up, sunburned and apologetic, Gerald had already talked me into accepting a handshake deal on a bookshelf he was going to build me. He built it. Solid oak. It's still in my living room. Derek and I got married 3 years later. Gerald danced at our wedding, badly and joyfully, to a Hall & Oates song. His wife, Derek's mother, had passed 3 years before I came into the picture, and I think that absence sat somewhere inside him always, a permanent kind of quiet. But he was never bitter. He was never the kind of man who let grief make him small. His children, however, were a different story. Derek is the middle child. His older sister, Renata, lives 40 minutes away in Bloomfield Hills and has, in the time I've known her, visited her father exactly as often as is required to maintain plausible deniability at family gatherings. His younger brother, Kyle, moved to Phoenix 6 years ago and calls on birthdays if he remembers. When Gerald was diagnosed with congestive heart failure 18 months ago, I was the one who sat in the cardiologist's office and took notes. I was the one who set up the pill organizer, who talked to the home health aide, who eventually made the call that he needed more care than we could provide at home, and helped him get settled at Mercy's cardiac unit. Derek came to the hospital the first week. Then things at work got complicated. Then there was a conference in Atlanta. Then there was always something, not a lie, exactly, but never quite the truth either. Renata brought a casserole once in October and posted a photo of herself holding Gerald's hand on Instagram, with the caption, "Precious Moments." Gerald didn't have an Instagram, he didn't know the photo existed. Kyle sent a gift card for Amazon. Gerald didn't have an Amazon account either. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound like a saint. I'm telling you this because it is simply what happened. I went because I wanted to go. Gerald and I had become something to each other over the years. I'm not sure there's a word for it that doesn't sound like a greeting card. He was the first person in that family who made me feel like I genuinely belonged, not as Derek's wife, but as myself. He remembered things. He asked follow-up questions. He called me on random Tuesdays just to tell me something funny he'd heard. When he got sick, I wasn't there out of obligation. I was there because I loved him. The last bad night was a Thursday. Gerald's oxygen levels had been dropping and the doctors had increased his monitoring. I'd been at the hospital until almost midnight, then driven home, then gotten the call at 6:47. Derek had been at the hospital on Tuesday. He'd sat with his father for about 40 minutes, checked his phone twice, and said he'd come back on the weekend. On Wednesday night, he'd told me he was going for drinks with some people from work. He didn't come home until after 2. I know because I was awake. I was always awake. I sat with Gerald's body for a long time before I called anyone. I know that might sound strange, but I needed the quiet. I needed to just be there with him in that room before the world of logistics and calls and paperwork came rushing in. I held the envelope in my lap and I let myself cry, which I hadn't been able to do in weeks, and it felt like something releasing from somewhere very deep. Eventually, I called Derek. It rang 4 times. Then, hello. Groggy, confused, the particular voice of someone who had been asleep and wasn't expecting the world to have moved without them. "Your dad passed," I said, "about an hour ago." A long pause. Then, okay, I'll be there. He showed up 90 minutes later. His hair was still wet from the shower. He hugged me briefly, formally, like I was a colleague at a funeral he didn't know well. Then he shook the doctor's hand and started asking questions about paperwork. I went to stand by the window. Gerald's attorney called the following week. His name was Mr. Powerk, Alderman, and he was exactly the kind of man you'd expect to be named. Alderman, silver-haired, careful, the sort of person who measured words before spending them. He said there would be a reading of the will at his office the following Thursday, and that all 3 of Gerald's children should be present. He paused, and then he said, "And Mrs. Patton." He was very specific that you should also be there. I told Derek that evening. He was distracted, scrolling through something on his laptop. "Sure," he said, without looking up. "Of course." I sat across the table from him and tried to find something in his face that I recognized. Something that matched the person I had thought I married. I couldn't find it. I'm not sure when it had gone. Whether it had always been missing and I hadn't wanted to see it, or whether it had left gradually, the way light leaves a room when the sun goes down and you don't notice until the room is dark. I still hadn't opened the envelope. I don't know why I kept waiting. Maybe I knew, the way I had known the morning he died, that whatever was inside it would change something, and I wasn't ready to have something else change. I opened it the night before the attorney's meeting. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where Gerald and I had played gin rummy approximately 300 times, and I opened the envelope. There was a letter, and inside the letter was a key. The key was small and brass, the kind that opens a lockbox or a safety deposit drawer, with the number 7 scratched on it in Gerald's handwriting. The letter was 3 pages, written by hand, and I read it slowly, twice before I fully understood what it said. Gerald had known. He had known about the affair. He had known for 8 months, longer than I had. He'd found out through Kyle, apparently, who'd heard something from someone at Derek's office and had called his father, not to warn me, not to help, but to gossip, to fill an hour. And Gerald had sat with that knowledge, alone, and had made a series of very quiet, very deliberate decisions. The letter said, "I watched you come every day. I watched you hold my hand when you thought I was asleep. I watched you talk to my doctors and fight with my insurance and laugh at my stupid jokes even when you were tired. And I watched my son disappear. I have loved Derek his whole life, but I know who he is, and I know who you are, and I want you to know that I see the difference." I put the letter down and looked at the key for a while. Then I kept reading. There was a safety deposit box at Gerald's bank, First State, the branch on Maple, and the box contained documents. He had, in the months before his decline made it impossible, quietly worked with Mr. Alderman to restructure certain assets. The hardware stores had already been in the process of being sold to a regional chain, and that sale would close within 60 days of his death. A portion of the proceeds he had arranged would go to each of his children in equal thirds as their inheritance. But Gerald had also spent 40 years of working and saving generating other assets. A brokerage account, proceeds from the sale of his family home in Kalamazoo 4 years ago, a life insurance policy, none of those were in the will. Those he had placed into a trust, and the trustee, the sole beneficiary of that trust, was me. The number was significant. Not rich in the way people use that word casually, but significant. Enough to buy a house outright. Enough to breathe differently. Enough that when I looked at it on paper, I had to read it twice to make sure I hadn't misplaced a decimal. There was also a note from Mr. Alderman clipped to the back of Gerald's letter, explaining that the trust had been established legally and cleanly, that it had been Gerald's wish and his right to arrange his estate as he saw fit, and that I should feel no obligation to explain or defend this to anyone. He had signed the letter with more love than I always remembered to say out loud. Dad. He had called himself Dad. I had never asked him to. He'd just started doing it sometime around year 3 of my marriage, quietly, like it was simply true and always had been. I sat at that kitchen table for 2 hours. The will reading the next morning was held in a conference room that smelled like old carpet and expensive coffee. Derek sat to my left. Renata sat across from him, wearing the particular expression of someone who believes they already know what is about to happen. Kyle had flown in from Phoenix. He'd made it for the will reading, if not for the final months of his father's life, and sat at the end of the table scrolling through his phone until Mr. Alderman asked him to put it away. Mr. Alderman read the will. Each of the 3 children received their third of the hardware store sale. Reasonable. Expected. Renata nodded. Kyle did a mental calculation that was visible on his face. Derek glanced at me. Then Mr. Alderman explained the trust. The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that happens when people are rapidly recalculating. Renata spoke first. "What does that mean exactly?" Mr. Alderman explained again patiently, in slightly different words. "That can't be right," Kyle said, sitting up straighter. "That doesn't make sense. She's not. She's his daughter-in-law." "She was the individual your father chose," Mr. Alderman said, in the tone of a man who had anticipated this conversation and was unbothered by it. "He had every legal right to make that determination." Derek said nothing. He was looking at the table. I looked at him and I thought, he knows why. He already knows exactly why. Renata said there would need to be a review. Kyle said something about contesting. Mr. Purst will... Alderman let them finish and then explained, again, with unshakable calm, that the trust had been established with full legal counsel 18 months ago, that it was airtight, and that Gerald had left a recorded statement, audio on file with the firm, explaining his reasoning, which would be made available in the event of any legal challenge. Gerald had thought of everything. The meeting ended. We filed out into the corridor. Renata walked past me without making eye contact. Kyle said to no one in particular. This is insane, and then took out his phone. Derek and I walked to the parking structure together. Neither of us spoke until we reached my car. Did you know? He asked. I found out last night, I said. Did you know why? He looked away. The parking structure was cold, a particular kind of cold that echoes. Derek, I said, did you know why he did this? A long moment, then. I messed up. That was it. That was what he gave me. 3 words. I had loved this man for 9 years, and that was what I received. I messed up. Not her name, not an explanation, not the full accounting of what had apparently been an 8-month deception that his own dying father had known about before I did. I had prepared something for this moment. I had written it out in my head on the drive over, but standing there in the cold of the parking structure, I found I didn't want to deliver a speech. I was too tired for speeches. I'll be staying with Laurel for a while, I said. Laurel was my college roommate, lived 20 minutes away, had already said yes when I texted her 2 nights before. I think you know this is done. Derek started to say something. I watched him start and then stop, and I thought, there it is. The version of him that always knew how to talk his way into things but never learned how to stop. Okay, he said finally. I got in my car. Here is the part of the story where I'm supposed to tell you it got easier quickly. That I found my footing fast, that I moved forward with certainty, that Gerald's letter had handed me everything I needed and I simply picked it up and ran. That's not quite how it happened. The next 6 months were hard in the way that things are hard when you are grieving 2 things at once. A man who deserved to be grieved, and a version of your life that turned out to be something different than you thought it was. I stayed at Laurel's for 3 weeks, then rented a small apartment in Ferndale while the divorce worked through the courts. Michigan's a no-fault state, which meant it was cleaner than it might have been, but clean doesn't mean painless. Renata sent 1 email suggesting I consider returning the trust funds out of respect for the family. I read it once, then deleted it. I did not respond. There was nothing to say. Kyle called Derek, apparently, not me. His outrage was pointed in that direction where it didn't concern me. I accessed the safety deposit box with the brass key. Inside were exactly the documents Mr. Alderman had described, plus 1 more item, a photograph of Gerald and me from 2 Christmases ago at his house, both of us holding mugs of hot cider and squinting into the sun. He'd asked the home health aide to take it. On the back in his handwriting, my favorite people are the ones who show up. I had it framed. It's on my desk now. I won't pretend that the money didn't matter. It did. It mattered in the way that breathing room matters when you've been holding your breath for a long time. It let me make choices without panic, to take a month before rushing into the next job, to find an apartment I actually liked instead of just one I could afford, to sit with the question of what I actually wanted, which is a question I hadn't been able to hear myself ask in years. What I found sitting with that question was this: I wanted to be somewhere Gerald would have approved of. Somewhere that used what I knew. I had spent 14 months navigating insurance systems and care coordination and the particular bureaucratic maze that families face when someone they love is aging and the system isn't built to help them. I had made mistakes and learned from them and developed opinions. Strong ones. I started volunteering at a senior advocacy nonprofit called ClearPath, which worked with families in Wayne County navigating elder care logistics, insurance, benefits, care transitions. I went on Tuesday evenings, then Thursday mornings. Within 4 months, they'd offered me a part-time staff position. I took it. That was 8 months ago. Last month, they offered me the program director role. I said yes before they finished the sentence. I ran into Derek once at a gas station off I-75, about 5 months after everything. He looked tired. We exchanged a few sentences about nothing. He mentioned he was seeing someone. I told him I was glad he was doing okay and I meant it, which surprised me. I had expected to feel more. What I felt instead was a kind of quiet, the same quiet I'd felt in Gerald's hospital room after. The quiet of something that has completed itself. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was good. Really good. He nodded like he believed me, and I got in my car and I drove home to my apartment, where Gerald's bookshelf, solid oak, still standing, holds the books I've been reading since I finally had time to read again. There are things I carry from all of this. Some of them are heavy, some lighter than I expected. I carry the knowledge that showing up is not nothing, that it is in fact everything, that in the years when Derek was letting calls go to voicemail and Renata was posting photos for an audience and Kyle was sending gift cards, I was sitting on a vinyl hospital chair learning the difference between a DNR conversation and a comfort care conversation, and that Gerald saw it. And that being seen, truly seen, by even one person is worth more than any room full of people performing their care for each other. I carry the photograph on my desk. I carry the phrase he used with me once on a Tuesday call when I was venting about something small, and he listened and then said, "Sweetheart, some people will only ever show you who they are when something is asked of them. The showing is the answer. You don't have to ask twice." I didn't understand it fully then. I do now. Some nights I still drive past the hospital on my way home from Clearpath. I don't know why exactly. I don't stop. It's just there. Part of the map of this period of my life. The building where I sat alone at 6:47 in the morning and held an envelope with my name on it in shaky handwriting. The building where someone decided, quietly and without any fanfare, that I was worth the deciding. I think about what Gerald knew that I didn't. That the people who disappear when it costs something have already told you everything. That love isn't declared. It's demonstrated in the small and inconvenient and unglamorous moments that don't make good Instagram captions. That a person can plant something true in the middle of a difficult season and trust it to grow after they're gone. He was right about that. It's growing. I've thought a lot about why Gerald did what he did the way he did it. He could have told me. He could have pulled me aside on one of those Tuesday afternoons and said, "I know about the affair. I know what my son is. I want you to be careful." He had 8 months. He had plenty of quiet afternoons and plenty of opportunity. He chose not to. And the longer I sit with that, the more I think I understand it. Gerald was a man who believed that people reveal themselves through action, not through being told. He didn't want to hand me a conclusion. He wanted to let everything play out the way it was always going to play out, and then make sure that when it did, I wasn't left with nothing. That's not luck. That's not fate in any mystical sense. That's just the quiet logic of cause and effect. The understanding that what a person does, consistently, over time, in the moments that cost something, is what determines what comes back to them. Derek made his choices, one skipped hospital visit at a time, one unanswered call at a time. Renata made hers with a casserole and an Instagram post. Kyle made his with a gift card and a flight booked only for the will reading. And I made mine. Not because I was calculating a return, but because Gerald mattered to me, and showing up for the people who matter to you is just what you do. Gerald saw all of it. And Gerald quietly made his own choice. There's something I've been trying to articulate for months, something that feels important but keeps slipping when I reach for the right words. It has to do with integrity. Not the word the way people use it in speeches, but the actual texture of it in daily life. Integrity is what you do when you're tired and no one is watching, and there's no obvious reward on the other side. It's the drive you make at 7 a.m. to a hospital when nobody is thanking you. It's the conversation with the cardiologist you have to have 3 times before you understand it. It's staying anyway, even when staying is inconvenient, even when the person you came home to is already somewhere else in spirit. I didn't do any of that to be rewarded. But I think, and this is the part I keep coming back to, the people who act with that kind of quiet integrity don't usually do it for reward. Which is maybe exactly why the reward, when it comes, fits so well. It comes from people like Gerald, who simply watched long enough to know the difference. What I know now, that I didn't know 2 years ago, is that resilience isn't about bouncing back. It's about being willing to keep going when there's nothing dramatic to sustain you. No big revelation, no crisis to mobilize around, just the ordinary hard work of showing up on a Tuesday when you'd rather not, or sitting with grief without performing it for anyone, or building a new version of your life, one small decision at a time in a rented apartment in Ferndale with an oak bookshelf that someone made you with his own hands. Gerald gave me money, yes. But what he actually gave me was proof that being a person of character is not invisible, that someone, somewhere, is always watching, not to judge, but to understand, and that who you are in the small moments is, ultimately, all you are. I think about that on the drive home from Clearpath, passing the hospital on the 94. I don't need it to mean anything mystical. I just need it to be true, and it is. I've seen it. I lived it. That's enough.